Good evening. My name is John Grotzinger, and I'm the chair of the Division of Geological and Planetary Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here on this cold and chilly night to hear the science lecture by my colleague Claire Buckholtz. Claire got her undergraduate degree from Yale University in 2009, and then her PhD also in geology from MIT in 2015, and then we hired her as a postdoc at that time, and this led us to eventually hire her onto the faculty, and that's why she's here today giving the lecture. Claire's expertise is very similar to mine and the tools that she uses, which is mostly her feet, out in the field, walking around, mapping the earth, and looking for rocks to bring back to the lab and study. But she studies a very different part of the earth than I do. She studies the part of the earth that represents its deeper interior, and I study the part of the earth that represents more of the processes that take place at the surface. But during the course of her postdoc, which she did in collaboration with John Eiler and Ed Stolper, she had the very clever idea that maybe you could use these rocks that are deep in the earth as recorders of past surface processes, and that's what she's going to talk to you about tonight. This is a special lecture series. It's the 100th anniversary of the Watson Lecture Series, and without further ado, I'll leave you to a video that will introduce Claire a little bit more.
My mom always jokes that when I was little, I came to her and said I wanted to be a rock scientist, like instead of a rocket scientist. And my pockets were always full of rocks. I think there's always been something about just observing the natural landscape and just trying to understand, what it is and why it's there. And, rocks are very tangible. I've just always liked them. And they're all different, right? My name is Claire Bucholz, and I'm an assistant professor of geology at Caltech, and I study igneous rocks, so rocks that form from the cooling and crystallization of magmas. If you go back to the rock cycle, igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks, I think most kids still learn about that. The rocks that I actually study are mostly the metamorphic and igneous rocks. People call them hard rocks versus soft rocks. I mean, all rocks are hard to some extent, but the soft rocks are the sedimentary rocks that are formed from weathered rocks on the surface of the earth and then deposited. You can take those sedimentary rocks and you can bring them down within the earth, and then they can become magmas or get subducted and then influence the composition of magmas that are erupted in subduction zones. So it's fun. It's neat because it's interdisciplinary. A lot of times sort of sedimentary geologists do their thing and igneous petrologists do their thing, but I get to interact with both of those groups. So. I mostly focus projects around field-based endeavors. Then I go back in the lab, and being able to go and look at rocks and have some idea of what you're looking at and how old they might be. My research really is grounded in sort of that first principles observations of like what's below my feet. And I think everyone sort of has an innate curiosity of you know, the rocks that they see on a car trip or when they're hiking. One of our favorite places to go is just up into the San Gabriels. There's a lot of old forest roads up there that get you off sort of the main highways, and there's really cool rocks there. I mean, for example, there's a rock called an anorthosite it's over 1 billion years old, and it really hasn't been studied, and no one really knows how they form. It's intense and cool and just awe-inspiring, you know, just sitting up in the San Gabriels. So, you know, if we're out anyway, like, why not pull over and take a look at it? That's one of the really fun things about geology, is that the rocks don't come to you, so you have to go to them.
Hi. Good evening. Good evening. I first want to just say thank you, John, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to everyone involved in the organization of the Watson Lecture Series. And also thank you to all of you here in the audience, and also everyone who's listening in online. I know everyone has busy schedules, so I appreciate you carving out a little bit of time from your Wednesday evening. I'm also really glad that I'm finally able to give this lecture. It's been a little bit of a process. I was first slated to give a Watson lecture, I think it was April 1st of 2020, so that was sort of an April Fool's, and didn't happen, obviously. And then I was supposed to give it last year in January, but one of my kids came down with COVID, so I'm finally here, third time's the charm, and hopefully nothing can happen in the next 45 minutes to stop the lecture. So today what I want to do is take you through some of my research, exploring how the changes in the composition of the atmosphere and the hydrosphere at the surface of the Earth might have actually affected the chemistry of rocks formed more deeply within the Earth. And particularly, I'm interested in the history and the interplay between changes in the concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere and the igneous rock record. So those are rocks formed from magma deep within the Earth. Before I get started, I do want to recognize the funding sources for a lot of the research that I've done, in addition to Caltech getting me started and off on my career. But the National Science Foundation has been instrumental. I have a career grant to explore these topics. And then there's been a number of collaborators from different universities that I'm working with. So what I want to do is to start off with this photo. This was of my two older kids. It was taken back in New Year's of 2021. So this was the weird holiday, right, sort of at the peak of the pandemic, when we weren't sure whether we could, get together with family or not get together with family. So we just decided to go out to the Mojave and take a camping trip and enjoy a campfire out there, watch the moon rising over the mountains. But the reason my kids are able to enjoy this campfire comes from the fact that we have a very oxygen-rich atmosphere on the modern Earth. So 21% of our atmosphere is composed of oxygen. And the reason they're able to, or oxygen facilitates this experience for them, is first they're these large animals that have aerobic needs, so they're actually able to exist. But then further beyond that, the oxygen is required to allow for the combustion of the cellulose in that wood. So you need a certain threshold of oxygen to actually to have fires. So this is a really unique feature of modern Earth. I mean, compared to our neighboring planets who have atmospheres dominated by carbon dioxide, but also it's a feature that's really unique to the relatively recent past in Earth. So Earth's atmosphere has not always been as rich in oxygen. And that's the story that I want to tell you today, at least for the first part of this talk, and then I'll link it into some of the research that I've been doing. So the way that we know that oxygen concentrations have varied over the course of Earth's history is through studying the sedimentary rock record. So these are rocks that have been deposited at the surface of the Earth, so in direct contact with the atmosphere, or deposited in the ocean, so in contact with the hydrosphere, which interacts with the atmosphere and can record something about changing oxygen concentrations. So this really is our primary archive. And what geologists have noticed for quite some time, actually, even just from macroscopic observation, is that as you go back into the rock record, the sedimentary rock record, the rocks start to look quite different. So I first want to take you back about 3 billion years ago to the Witwatersrand Basin, which is now in what is now present-day South Africa. And at that time, there was a big river system that was flowing from the mountains and dumping into the oceans. And there was the deposition of rocks such as mudstones and also conglomerates like you see here. And what this basin is famous for, or one thing that it's famous for, is that it's a very rich placer gold deposit. So about 20% of all the gold that has ever been mined on Earth comes from this basin. So here's an old historical map of the gold fields around Johannesburg. But for the non-economic geologist, it's also interesting because you get these very distinct conglomerates here. So you can see these big round golden pebbles in this conglomerate. And this is not gold, it's pyrite or fool's gold. But the reason that this is interesting is that these kind of rocks don't form in the modern day. And the reason for that is that pyrite at the surface of the Earth is very unstable. So if you expose it to oxygen and water, what will happen is that you essentially create rust. So you can see this pyrite cube. This is sort of an unweathered one, but if you've ever bought pyrite from a rock shop and you leave it out for too long, you'll notice that it starts to get rusty. You drop it in a glass of water, you'll notice the same thing. And so essentially you create rust, so the iron in the pyrite gets oxidized, and you also generate sort of an acidic solution. So this is how acid mine drainage forms. So the fact that in these 3 billion-year-old conglomerates we find these large rounded pyrite cobbles indicates that these pyrite grains were transported over large distances in these riverbeds and that they weren't breaking down. And so the inference here is that oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere were low enough to allow for the formation of these conglomerates and for the pyrite to remain stable. So this is a very macroscopic observation. So this is a different kind of rock that's not formed today. There's more subtle variations in the rock record too, and there's really a host of them. Today I'm going to highlight a few of them that are most salient for my research. But one of a really important observation that's been made is by looking at sulfur isotopes in sedimentary rocks and sedimentary sulfides. So for example, maybe some of those pyrites there in that conglomerate. And without going too much into the weeds of the sulfur isotopes, I do want to explain a little bit of the background because it's one area that I've researched, but not in sedimentary rocks, but in igneous rocks. So sulfur isotopes, there's 4 different isotopes of sulfur, 4 different masses, or masses of 32, 33, 34, and 36. And during most chemical reactions, the way that these isotopes are going to be fractionated or separated from each other is going to be predictable and related to the relative differences between the masses of these isotopes. And so what I'm going to show you now is a timeline throughout. I think I don't have anything but timelines in this talk because I'm hopefully telling you the story of atmospheric oxygen. So I'll show you a couple. And so on these timelines on the x-axis, you'll see age in billions of years. So over here is present day, and then it'll get older and older up to, most of them will end somewhere in this range in here. Earth is a little over 4.5 billion years old. And here what I'm showing you is this notation, or this value here, which is this capital delta 33S. And basically what this is a measure of is how far away from that sort of predictable fractionation by the relative differences of the masses of 3 of the sulfur isotopes, how far away the sulfides are actually, if you go and you look at the sulfur isotopic composition of these sulfides, how far away from that sort of relationship these sulfides or these sulfur isotopes are fractionated. And this behavior is called mass-independent fractionation or mass-anomalous fractionation of sulfur isotopes. And we know that in the modern day, so if you're over here, if you have sulfides forming in sedimentary rocks, that we don't see any of this mass-anomalous behavior. But it doesn't take an isotope geochemist or anyone else with any sort of specialty in these rocks to see that there's a difference as you go back to about 2.3 billion years ago. And all of a sudden, this value here of this cap delta 33S starts to deviate away from 0. So we start to see this mass-independent fractionation occurring in the sulfides. So we know in the modern day, even at the surface of the Earth, we're not seeing these mass-independent fractionation processes occurring, but it does happen high up in the atmosphere, so up in the stratosphere, where you get photochemical reactions of sulfur-bearing gas species. So the idea here is that up in the modern day, you get this flux of high-energy UV radiation that can get into the stratosphere and drive these SO2 or these sulfur dioxide photochemical reactions and actually impart these mass-independent fractionations of the sulfur isotopes. But it doesn't, these signals don't reach to the surface of the Earth and doesn't penetrate all the way through the atmosphere because we have abundant oxygen, both molecular oxygen and ozone, that blocks that high-energy UV radiation. But back going before 2.3 billion years ago, we didn't have as much oxygen in the atmosphere, and that high-energy UV radiation was able to penetrate all the way to the surface of the Earth and generate this mass anomalous signature in terms of the sulfur isotopes. So this observation was made in the early 2000s. It was really a discovery. And if we go and people have gone to the lab and have measured, the oxygen concentrations required to stop this UV radiation from causing these mass anomalous fractionations of the sulfur isotopes, or the oxygen concentrations required to actually result in the oxidation of pyrite, and we can start to place some quantitative constraints on what the oxygen concentrations were in the atmosphere at that time. So again, this is a timeline here, an age of billions of years. And what I'm plotting now are estimates for the oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere relative to modern. So at 100%, that would be modern day. And if we use these constraints from the sedimentary rocks prior to about 2.3 billion years ago, the constraints place the concentration of oxygen at 1/1000% of present-day atmospheric levels, so 5 orders of magnitude lower. And then after 2.3 billion years ago, if you continue to look at the sedimentary rock record, what we find is that during this period, we have other proxies that we can use to try to constrain oxygen concentrations. So we no longer see these pyrites, which are called detrital pyrites. We no longer see this mass anomalous fractionation of sulfur isotopes. And so it has to be above this threshold. But there's other proxies, as I mentioned, that constrain the concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere to somewhere between 1 to 10% of present-day atmospheric levels. So this bottom limit, which I won't talk about in too much detail, comes from redox-sensitive trace elements. But we know that the oxygen concentrations didn't actually reach present-day atmospheric levels because when we go and we look at sedimentary rocks deposited in the ocean, we find evidence from those that the deep ocean still remained anoxic. So there wasn't enough oxygen in the atmosphere to actually oxygenate fully the deep ocean. And then as we go along, though, and I should say that this is still very much an area of active research, and these might not be perfectly flat lines, but these are sort of the broad constraints that we have. The next best evidence we have, sort of really solid evidence for what oxygen concentrations were doing in the atmosphere, starts after about 300 million years ago when charcoal enters the sedimentary rock record. And so as I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, there needs to be a certain threshold of oxygen to actually allow for the combustion of cellulose. And so when we get to about 300 million years ago, we start to see charcoal. And here's an example of a sandstone with chunks of charcoal in it that was deposited around 300 million years ago. So this gives us evidence that there was wood around and it was combusting, and that oxygen levels were sufficiently high, so over about 70% of present day levels to allow for this combustion. It also kind of puts a cap on how high oxygen levels could have been. So if oxygen gets too high, then essentially everything starts to combust. And we know there weren't rampant wildfires everywhere because we do see evidence in the fossil record that things were getting preserved in an uncharred state. So then you can see that I've sort of left this black area here, this gap in the record, and this is a very a highly researched part of Earth history. And one reason for this is that this is the time period when animals evolved. So there was this transition from basically microbes to aerobic multicellular animals. And because we see animals, it indicates that oxygen levels were high enough to create this permissible environment for which animal evolution could finally proceed. And so this places the constraint somewhere around greater than 1% of present day atmospheric levels, starting somewhere around 600 million years ago. Now, the fossils that we first see in the record for animals starting at this time were fairly simple. This is an example of one here, and there's also a scale bar here with centimeters. So you can see it's sort of, these animals were centimeter scale, some smaller to millimeter scale. But they were basically these soft body organisms that were either fixed to the seabed or sort of slithering around it. They weren't very complicated. But by 420 million years ago, we start to see much larger animals. So there was the development of a whole class of predatory fish. This is one example, and you can see a scale bar or a human here called Dunkleosteus. Could probably eat you in one bite. And so by this time, you develop these really complex animals. And because oxygen requirements of animals scale positively with their size, this indicates that the oceans by this time had to have significantly more oxygen in them to support these large predatory fish. So this is one example from the fossil record, thinking about biology. There's a whole host of other things that geologists look at in the sedimentary record. I'm going to point out another one that is directly related to changes in biology at this time. So recently, people have been also looking at the phosphorus concentrations in sedimentary rocks. And again, this is a timeline from present day to 3.5 billion years old. And so this is just basically a big compilation of phosphorus in these sedimentary rocks that you can imagine being deposited sort of in coastal areas. Now, phosphorus is interesting because it's an important macronutrient for generation for all sorts of biological processes. And its concentration in the ocean is thought to limit the amount of carbon biomass that can be produced through photosynthesis. And one thing that you can see, very similar to some of the other records that I've shown you, is that there's a distinctive switch in the behavior of phosphorus in these sedimentary rocks. So starting before 700, maybe 500 million years ago, it's sort of a sparse record in here. The average concentration and both sort of the maximum concentration of phosphorus in sedimentary rocks was quite low. And then it increases after this time period to much higher levels. And the way that this is interpreted is that phosphorus sequestration or burial in sediments was more efficient after this time period, whereas earlier in Earth history, phosphorus wasn't being buried in quite the same way. Or as efficiently, I should say. And so the way that phosphorus gets into these sediments, there's a couple of different pathways, but a large proportion of the phosphorus is actually bound up in organic matter. So basically, biology is using it. And then when this organic carbon rains out into the sediments, the phosphorus goes with it. And so this is a direct signal of more enhanced phosphorus being derived from organic matter in these younger sedimentary rocks. And it's thought to be, there's a lot of different models for why this is the case, but it's thought to be directly tied to changing oxygen concentrations in the ocean. There's one final way that I want to highlight that people have been getting at changing concentrations of oxygen in the oceans, and that's not directly through sedimentary rocks, but it's from looking at the record of basalts that are formed on the seafloor. So here you can see a map showing the topography of the ocean basins and this whole system of mid-ocean ridges where new oceanic crusts form. So this is a divergent plate boundary where you get upwelling of the mantle and partial melting of the mantle to form this new seafloor crust. And during this process, you can imagine that there's a lot of hot material that's moving upwards essentially into contact with the seafloor. And this sets up intense hydrothermal circulation cells where vast amount of seawater circulate through this oceanic crust. Now, there are places on Earth where the seafloor, these slivers of oceanic crust have been preserved and actually sort of thrust up onto the continents. And we can go and look at that. And because this oceanic crust has been so intensely altered by seawater, we can start to piece apart the chemistry of those fragments of oceanic crust to understand something about seawater chemistry at the time of formation of these rocks. And so people have started to use this as an archive. And one of my colleagues who was a graduate student here at Caltech has recently looked at this and has just compiled data on these fragments of oceanic crust throughout Earth history. So again, here's a timeline. And what's being plotted here now is the percentage of iron that's in its oxidized form. So the amount of iron in its 3+ form relative to all the iron in the rock. And you can see that up until about 500 million years ago, or 0.5 billion years ago, this ratio, or this percentage of iron as oxidized iron, has remained fairly low, and then it increases. And there's caveats with interpreting large data sets, but the simplest explanation for this, after poking around this data set for a while, is that this likely represents the transition from an anoxic ocean up until about 0.5 billion years ago to one that had a lot of dissolved oxygen in it, that when the seawater started to circulate through this oceanic crust, it actually oxidized the iron within these rocks. So this is sort of a review again of the history. So again, we have this period of very low oxygen concentrations prior to about 2.3 billion years ago. There's this dramatic jump, which I don't think I mentioned before, but it's called the Great Oxygenation or the Great Oxidation Event, that brought us up to levels of 1 to maybe 10% of present-day atmospheric levels of oxygen. And then there's probably a transitional period in here, but that's still getting sorted out. But certainly by the last 300 million years ago, oxygen levels were near present-day atmospheric levels. So that's sort of the broad history of atmospheric oxygen, and I just wanted to get it out there because now I'm going to start to talk about how some of the research that I've been doing interacts with the story of atmospheric oxygen. And coming back to essentially what this boils down to is thinking about how the sedimentary records and the record of rocks that formed near the surface of the Earth or in contact with the hydrosphere have been essentially brought into the source regions of magmatic rocks or igneous rocks. And so again, it comes back to the rock cycle, and you can think about it sort of in, everyone's probably familiar with this to some extent, but that all these rocks are connected, and one group can go to the other group. And the reason for this is that we have a very active plate tectonic regime on Earth, so you get continual recycling of rock types. So, at the simplest form, you have igneous rocks first generated. This fundamentally comes from melting of the mantle. These can be then weathered to produce and deposited to produce sedimentary rocks. And then the sedimentary rocks, if they are buried and heated to sufficiently high temperatures, can melt. And then you return back to igneous rocks, albeit a different igneous rock than what you started with, per se. So there's two primary archives that I use in my research to try to understand these connections. And the first is quite simply sort of that cycle that I explained to you just now, where you basically take sedimentary rocks and you melt them. And this happens generally in convergent plate margins. So here's a cartoon of a subduction zone with one plate going down underneath another plate. And in between these two sort of big masses of land here, which this is your volcano above a subduction zone, and here's a mass, you imagine it as just a piece of continental crust. But in between, intervening in the oceans, you'll have a basin, and sediments will get deposited there. And if you continue on with the subduction process, the plates are going to get closer together. And eventually, the two pieces of high-standing crust will collide. The sediments are going to get sandwiched between them, and you'll get this collisional event. And these sedimentary rocks are going to be buried. And if they're buried to sufficiently high pressures and temperatures, then they will melt. And they generate a very specific kind of granite. So there's a whole host of different kinds of granites, but this is a specific type of granite, and they're often referred to as S-type granites that have a very clear signature of being derived from sedimentary rocks. So as an example of this that all of you are probably familiar with, here's an example of a collisional origin. So this is the Himalayas here, and those arose from the collision between the Indian subcontinent when it tried to take a nosedive under Asia, and so it pushed up the intervening crust in between. And during this process, similar to what I just described to you, sediments were caught up, and they were buried and partially melted. So here is just an example of that. This is the south face of Nuptse, which is just across the valley from Everest. And what you can see here, even if you're not a geologist, is that there's two rock types. There's black rocks and there's white rocks. And the white rocks are the granites, and the black rocks are actually sedimentary rocks that are the source regions or representative of the source regions for these granites. And you can even see kind of these wispy veins or spider networks, and those are basically conduits of these granites that are invading and infiltrating these sedimentary rocks. So these are found all over the Himalayas. They're formed about 15 to 20 million years ago. In my context, I'm interested in much older granites, so going back billions of years to try to think about, can we capture these changing sedimentary signals in the igneous rock record. So luckily, Earth has preserved a few of those examples that I can go and study. But you can imagine, so for example, maybe here are the Himalayas, but eventually if this was or you can imagine this as being sort of a Himalaya-style collisional event that happened billions of years ago. Eventually, erosion will expose these granites, and we can go and look at them. And so here are just a few examples to show you sort of their characteristics. This is just a field photo, but what I like about this is that you can see there's sort of these darker blobs with lineations or striations in them. And then you also have this white material around it. This white material is a granite, so it's a granitic melt. And these are basically rafts of sedimentary rocks that sort of got caught up during the formation of these granites and frozen in place when it's solidified. So you can sometimes see very clear connections between the granites and the sedimentary rocks. They're also quite interesting granites. So I mentioned that they have a lot of features that indicate that they come from sedimentary rocks. And one of the features is that they have more aluminum in them than most granites relative to other elements. And so these here are big garnets. So garnets is a very aluminum-rich mineral. And so one thing that you see in these granites is a really interesting and unique mineralogy reflecting the luminous nature of sedimentary rocks, the sedimentary rocks from which they're derived. So the way that I've approached my research in a lot of different ways, but sort of one of the fundamental ways that I go about studying these rocks is I go and I sample the rocks. I go out in the field and I'll either take maps that have already been published or create new maps of these rocks, and then essentially just sample them and bring them back to the lab to study. And I've been looking for ones that span across much of Earth history. So to get to the really old ones, you have to go to the interiors of continents where the oldest continental crust is preserved. And so a lot of my work has taken me to places like Canada, where some of the oldest rocks in North America are found. So this is an example from Ontario. Here's one of my graduate students who is helping sample in the field. And here's just an example of what sampling might look like. This is in Ontario, and so one of the tricks that we had to find exposure, because it's all glacially polished and very forested, but you can get in and try to sample where logging companies have gone through, because that's one way you can actually see and find the exposed rock. So that's an old logging road back there. Other examples, just for some fun trivia, I thought that you are probably familiar with. So in terms of these granites, these what they call S-type granites that are derived from the melting of sedimentary rocks, the top of the Grand Teton is made out of one of these granites, so it's about 2.5 billion years old. Another famous example is Mount Rushmore. So Mount Rushmore is carved out of the Harney Peak granite, so this is in the Black Hills. And while most of the carving is actually in the granites, one thing that maybe you haven't noticed before in pictures of it, or if you've been lucky enough to go there, is this big black blob underneath George and Thomas here. And that's actually a big chunk of sedimentary rock that's sort of this entrained bit of the source region for these granites. So that's sort of just a fun trivia. So I've gone around and I've gotten many different samples of these granites. And one thing that one aspect of my research that I've looked into is actually investigating the sulfur isotope geochemistry of these granites for the reasons that I explained in this talk, or explained earlier in this talk, that we see this anomalous behavior in terms of the sulfur isotopes in the sedimentary rocks. And so one of the questions that I had was whether we could trace this back to these granitic rocks, which would be really interesting for several reasons. One reason is that just simply by, this is a very, it would give a very clear timestamp on the material that these granites were derived from. And not just these granites, but in the field of igneous petrology, one thing that we're very interested in is figuring out the sources of different magmas and how old those sources were. So if you see this sort of mass anomalous behavior in the sulfur isotopes, it's a very clear signature that you're essentially having sulfur that was participating in these reactions in a very low oxygen atmosphere prior to 2.3 billion years old, now getting delivered and transported deeper into the Earth. It can also answer some interesting questions in the reverse about what did the sulfur sedimentary cycle look like. So these granites really melt large volumes of sedimentary rocks, and so it can give us some insight into sort of what the bulk sedimentary systems were doing. So it kind of goes both ways with these granites. So just as an example, what this work looks like, it's a lot of detailed work. So this kind of analysis is not a routine analysis that is done for most igneous rocks. So we really had to go in there and try to mine out these sulfides. So this is just an example, actually from a sedimentary rock, but similarly for granites. Go in and we separate out these little sulfide grains that are, at most a couple hundred microns in dimension. And then we separate them out, and we can either analyze them in bulk, or we can go in there with an ion beam and ablate away little bits of the sulfur, or of the sulfide, and analyze the sulfur isotopic composition. And so it's fairly tedious work, but we have been able to put together a record. And now this is showing a similar timeline, but now of this sort of this anomalous, this cap delta 33S, which again is measuring this anomalous fractionation behavior for sulfur isotopes. And you can see that granites, and now it's all for sulfides from granites, so not from sedimentary rocks, but from these granites that are derived from the partial melting of sedimentary rocks. And you can see that we actually do capture small mass-independent behavior of these sulfur isotopes in these granites prior to about 2.3 billion years. But then afterwards, they flatline down, which is sort of predicted from the rock record. So that's one aspect of some of the research that I've been doing, really focusing on this transition, this first great oxygenation event, and how it might have influenced the sedimentary rock record. Now I want to move a little bit down the timeline, and talk about the second oxygenation event, which started to influence the oxygen concentration significantly in the oceans. And I want to come back to the phosphorus record that I brought up earlier. So again, this is phosphorus concentrations in sedimentary rocks, where we see this shift in the phosphorus concentrations after about 700 to 500 million years ago. There's an increase in essentially the amount of organic matter that's getting put into sediments and remineralized to increase these phosphorus concentrations. And one thing, just through the analysis of my own samples that I've collected, but also from combing through the literature, I started to notice that there was time variance in the phosphorus concentrations of the granites as well. And so I put together a large compilation. Luckily, phosphorus it's a minor to major element in most rocks, and so it's routinely analyzed. It's not like the sulfur isotopes. And so I put together this compilation, and very similarly to the sedimentary rocks, we see an increase in the phosphorus concentrations of the granites after this time. So there's a lot of detail here, and the different colored symbols mean different things. And there's also a lot of things to think about when you do these large compilations. But if you go through all the caveats and you test the data set, again, sort of the simplest explanation for this that I was able to come up with is that these increases in phosphorus concentrations are really reflecting the changes in phosphorus in the sedimentary rock record. So essentially, you have a source rock that's more rich in phosphorus, and that generates magmas that have more phosphorus in them. And what's cool about this is it's really a direct signal of this enhanced transport of remineralized organic matter to sedimentary rocks. So big changes in the biosphere being directly delivered to the deep earth into this record of these S-type granites. And what's also neat about it too is that represents sort of a switch in the global phosphorus cycle, and that now you're sequestering phosphorus back into the crust, and there it will remain until it's weathered again, and then can get returned to be available to the biosphere to utilize again. So that's sort of cool. It's a direct change in how life was operating in the oceans related to oxygen concentrations, sort of stamped onto the granite record. So the final aspect of this talk that I want to bring up is a different kind of rock type, but that one that's also influenced by changes in the composition of the oceans. And that's rocks that are formed in subduction zones. So during this process of subduction, you have a oceanic plate, or this basaltic crust that I talked about before that's first formed at a spreading center. But this oceanic plate will go down. Because of the hydrothermal alteration that occurs in this interaction with seawater, it actually ends up being quite hydrated. So minerals, various hydrated minerals are in this plate, and as they subduct, they'll eventually reach their stability limits and break down and release water into this overlying mantle here, driving it to melt and produce magmas that are formed in volcanoes. So you're all, again, just as a concrete example, you're all probably familiar with some of these, but the Aleutians between Kamchatka and Alaska are a classic example of this, where the Pacific plate is diving under the North American plate and generating these large stratovolcanoes. So this is a Cleveland volcano that's erupting in 2006, and it was an image taken from the International Space Station. So you get a voluminous magma generation in these settings. So if we think about how this process works in the present day, one really important component of magmas generated in subduction zones is the composition of things that are getting subducted underneath them. So there's a contribution from this mantle that's melting, but because you get these dehydration reactions releasing water into the mantle wedge, they also deliver other signals of the material that you are subducting. So in the modern day, when we're forming the oceanic crust at these mid-ocean ridge spreading centers, again, you get these intense hydrothermal alteration cells. And so this oceanic crust is really carrying a signature of the seawater that it interacted with. And in the oxygenated oceans, since for the last 400 million years, 400 to 500 million years, there's abundant oxygen and also sulfate in the ocean, and this gets imprinted onto the oceanic crust, the hydrothermally altered oceanic crust during this process. And so iron that's in the oceanic crust gets oxidized during this process, and you also deposit a lot of sulfate. And both of these species have a lot of oxidizing power. And when they're ultimately subducted and delivered to the source regions of these arc magmas, they imprint this oxidized signature onto the arc magmas. So just as an example, if you take a mid-ocean ridge basalt, so one that hasn't been altered yet, and it's just sort of sampling the mantle, if you look at the amount of iron in there that's in its ferric form, it's about 10%. But if you go to subduction zone basalts, and again, taking an unaltered sample, it has about 20 to 30% of its iron as ferric iron. So you get this signature of basically oxidized material going down into the mantle and imprinting that oxidized signature onto subduction zone magmas. But you can imagine, prior to the oxygenation of the deep ocean, and what I showed you before from the record of hydrothermally altered basalts, that when you had this hydrothermal alteration process, you didn't really change the oxidation state of iron in the oceanic crust, and you also weren't depositing a lot of sulfate. There wasn't a lot in the ocean then. And so when this crust gets subducted, Your one prediction and one hypothesis that, that I wanted to test with my colleague Daniel Stolper up at Berkeley is to think about whether we might see a change in the redox state of these magmas forming in subduction zones across Earth history. And so similarly, we were able to go back into the rock record, comb through it, and try to find locations where these subduction zone magmatic rocks were preserved, and compile various indicators of their, how oxidized they were. And so this, again, is just looking at, this is the compilation that we were able to put together. And again, looking at the percent iron that's in its oxidized form, so the 3+ versus 2+, and you can see very similar to the record of the altered oceanic crust that we get an increase in the percentage of iron in its oxidized form after about 0.5 billion years ago. And so this is a direct way that the oxygenation of the deep oceans are imprinted on a very important class of igneous rocks. And it's not just looking at the iron speciation in these rocks. There's a number of other sort of redox-sensitive trace elements ratios that you can look at that support this conclusion as well. So this is sort of interesting, but it's more than just an academic exercise. So one thing that has been noted for a while is that certain kinds of ore deposits only form in subduction zone environments where the magmas are oxidized. And one example of that are porphyry copper deposits. So this is just an example of some of the copper-bearing minerals you might see there, so azurite and malachite. But the porphyry copper deposits, by far and away, produce the most copper of any other kind of ore deposit. You can think of examples like the Bingham Canyon mine out in Utah. But one thing that people have noticed by going back and compiling when these porphyry copper deposits formed is that they only started to form, whether you look at the total number of porphyry copper deposits or the tonnage of them, they only started to form after about 0.5 billion years ago. And so this one hypothesis here is that, that this is a direct result of the fact that before this, you just didn't have oxidized magmas to be able to generate these porphyry copper deposits. So we may owe a lot of our copper reserves to the fact that the deep oceans became oxygenated and actually facilitated the development of these ore deposits. So I'll leave you there. I know that was kind of a grand tour, and it touched on a bunch of different topics, but I'll give you sort of a quick summary. So hopefully I've been able to show you, well, first take you sort of on a walk through the history of atmospheric oxygen, and then show you how changes in the composition of the atmosphere have actually influenced rocks formed much more deeply in the Earth. So including these, the special type of granites that are formed directly from sedimentary rocks, but also from rocks formed in subduction zones, which are a very common class of igneous rocks. So the next time you're sitting around a campfire, maybe you can think back on this a little bit and appreciate just how unique Earth is in terms of its oxygen-rich atmosphere, and just take a few moments to marvel at it all, because it's a really interesting story. So thank you very much. I appreciate you listening.
Thank you for this great talk. I have a question for you from an online question from Rodney, asking about the Joshua Tree gneiss. And so I was going to sort of elaborate on that question and ask you what rocks that we might find here in Southern California when we're out on a hike are interesting or relevant to your research.
Yeah, that's a great question. So he was asking about Joshua Tree in particular. Yeah, so there's a number of different rocks around here, directly related to sort of subduction zone magmatism. The western margin of North America was an active subduction zone since a couple 100 million years ago all the way down to maybe about 70 million years ago. So even in the San Gabriel's right behind us, you can find some rocks that are 75 million years old that were formed sort of more in this subduction zone environment. In terms of these granites, the closest ones well, it's tricky. These granites are an outlier, but there are a lot of rocks that aren't sort of purely derived from the melting of sedimentary rocks, but they can be granites that have other sources and some sedimentary sources. And you can find some like that up in the Sierra Nevada. But the closest sort of pure sedimentary melt is probably out in, there's some in Arizona that are Proterozoic in age, so that's about 1.4 billion years old. And so that would probably be the closest one to go to, so. Yeah.
Three very quick questions, short questions. Given your research and looking at 2.5 billion years or 2.3 billion years and older, whether the markers are phosphorus, sulfur, or what have you, did Earth look a lot more like other planets prior to 2.3 billion years ago, given what you've seen in your research? Second, is there any indicators as we move forward through your research from way back there all the way to where we have a great oxygenation event? Is there any markers that indicate there'll be a great deoxygenation event for Earth? And then with all of that in mind, is there something to be had? What would be your comments for studying other planets if you could take samples the way you take samples here in other planets to say, one day there's going to be oxygen on Mars?
Yeah, no, those are all great questions. So I think so the first one was, okay, I have to remember them all again. Sorry, I have actually forgotten the first question, but what did it work? Yes, okay, so what did it look like? So one thing about Earth is that we do know that there was a hydrosphere on Earth at that time. And there's evidence that there was also, at a similar time on Mars, for example, that there was water at the surface of Mars. Earth also, at that time, most of the continents weren't emerged above water. You might have had small sort of isolated land masses, but most people think that you actually had most of the continents emerge above the water after about 2.5 billion years ago. In terms of what's happening, could we have a deoxygenation event? The way that, so we sort of have these steps in oxygen. Again, this is a bit far removed from what I actually try to study, but the way that people think about this is they think about sinks and sources of oxygen. And so one source of oxygen is photosynthesis. Another way that you can liberate oxygen is when you make organic matter from photosynthesis, you have to bury that organic matter really quickly. And otherwise, it'll just be reoxidized and consume all of that oxygen. And so throughout Earth history, again, it's a very active area of study, but most people think that there were things that sort of pushed the system out of equilibrium, whether it was major climatic events like a global glaciation, or there was a change in another sink or a source, or mostly a sink, I would say, is the composition of volcanic gases, whether they're oxidizing or reduced. So most people think that there was some sort of switch in the sink or the source. So currently, I think things are pretty stable. I'm probably not the expert to say whether we're going to have a dramatic oxygenation event, but most people think that things are pretty stable. And then in terms of searching for in other planets about signs of, I'm trying to remember the last part. Yeah, okay, so the one thing, so if I could sample, I mean, so the other thing that makes Earth really unique is that we have an active plate tectonic environment. So all these rocks that I study here, there's been physical mixing between the surface of the Earth and down deeper. There's some open questions maybe about Venus, what that looked like, but on most other planets we did not set up active plate tectonic systems. So there's definitely interesting rocks. It's mostly basalt that we find on other planets from an igneous perspective. And you can ask questions about the composition of those planets. But from a mixing perspective, at least to get to these sort of questions, you probably wouldn't find rocks like that. So.
Yes, Professor Bucholz, Arthur Lee, I'm a Caltech graduate here in chemical engineering. I'd like to understand a little bit more about the data that's in your field, since I don't know anything about your field. How should I really read the scatter, especially the vertical scatter of all these deltas and ratios? Is it because the timeline is very compressed that the vertical scatter is so large, or was there something to it that you can draw a line through that kind of scatter so easily?
Yeah, so with the line through that, I flashed a number of different plots up there. And I think the simplest answer to that is that we, as geologists, don't get to run the experiments, that Earth did it for us. And so it's sort of Earth's lab, and it generates, these rocks form, and then they have a long history. And so in terms of the scatter, especially in terms of, say, the last one that I showed looking at ferric iron, that was compiled from the literature. Some of these rock localities maybe are better preserved than others in the sense that they are potentially preserving the primary ratios better, but they've all had a long history. Of course, like any other analytical science, there is going to be analytical error, but the major dispersion there is not analytical error. The analyses are real. It's just that Earth has run its own experiments, and we don't get to control what happens to the rocks after they come out. So one of the big goals of anyone trying to study this is trying to find the best rocks, the most preserved ones to get at the true record. And so one thing with that plot that I showed, and one aspect that I'd like to continue with, is going back and trying to find those rocks and doing the analyses myself instead of compiling it from the literature. Yeah, but that's a great question.
Hi, I have a basic question about where the oxygen came from. So when it was released, prior to being the oxygenation event, it was in carbon dioxide mostly?
Yeah, so in terms of how the primary way oxygen is produced is through photosynthesis. And so there is some debate about when photosynthesis evolved and when did the oxygen levels actually increase in the atmosphere. But you had to have the evolution of photosynthesis in order to produce the oxygen. That's right.
So just like from an element balance, when all the oxygen got into oxygen gas, isn't there also a big signature about what happened to the carbon?
Yeah. So that people also study the carbon isotopic record of sedimentary rocks. And sometimes the records are in sync and it sort of makes sense, and sometimes there's periods where the carbon isotopic records don't always line up with the history of atmospheric oxygen as well. I don't think I can talk too much more on that just because it's a little bit outside of my realm of expertise, so I don't want to say anything that's not true.
So speaking as a biologist, I wonder if you could say some more about some other features of those plots. One is what is there, what looks like it's there, and the other is what looks like it's not there. And the molecular clocks for animal life go back to about 1 billion years ago, right? Mm-hmm. And I was shocked at the lack of obvious features around that, just preceding that time. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if that could have been masking some inhomogeneity on the Earth's surface, which might have allowed other places to be more oxygen-rich. The other question was, it looked like there was a real spike of oxygenation around 300 million years ago, or 250 or something, which is very near the Permian-Triassic extinction. And I was just wondering if there's any evidence that that could be caused by impact or by any other kind of event, or if something like that could have made life more vulnerable.
Yeah, no, so those are great questions. So in terms of the temporal sort of the sporadic nature, a lot of these rocks, it sort of depends on, again, sort of what we get in the rock record. And in particular, in terms of these granites, it only happens when you have continents colliding. There's a cyclical nature to how plates move on Earth. And so continents kind of collide and they all come together. These are your supercontinents that you might have heard of, like Pangea, and then they rift. And so you get a lot sort of densely in one place. And so that's sort of where we have rock records. And then there's time periods where there's really not a lot of rocks. So that period in what we think of as the Proterozoic, the rock record is slimmer there. And then in terms of the Permo-Triassic extinction, the oxygen levels actually, it happened sometime in the Paleozoic, but most people would say it probably increases before then. And mostly the Permo-Triassic extinction is ascribed to the Siberian traps, so big basalt flows that poured out of Siberia at that time. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So I know that are some traces of radioactive iron within some rocks in the ocean, and which imply that there was a supernova that happened some time ago. I'm wondering if the radiation from that supernova could have affected oxygen levels.
That is an interesting question, but I really don't have any information or knowledge about it, so I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer there. But okay. Yeah.
So throughout your presentation, I noticed that the rock record, at some points it seemed extremely flat and easy to read. However, as it spiked, there was more and more randomness within the data. Some points where there seemed to be data points on every part of the axis. How do you go about explaining that extraordinary randomness and seeming incoherence and dissonance of data?
Yeah, so you might be talking about just coming back to this plot, for example. And so here, what I would say is that there is a lot of variation here, and this was brought up in one of the other questions. And some of this is just dealing with how the rocks are preserved. But what you do see here is that, so the solid bars that are plotting here are averages of these different localities that we've compiled. But you can see that the maximum percentages of ferric iron do increase as you go to the younger ages. And prior to that, for the most part, you get much lower ferric over total iron ratios. It's tricky because these rocks have been at the surface for the whole history of Earth, and they've been at the surface of the Earth through much of the time period where there was oxygen in the atmosphere too. And so there is the possibility that they can get oxidized afterwards. And so again, this sort of comes back to going and trying to find the freshest rocks instead of just relying on a big data compilation. But yeah.
Well, you mentioned global glaciation. One of these events occurred near the end of the Precambrian, and I'm wondering how close to the this global glaciation. God, I've forgotten my question. Global glaciation and the other big event, which was the secondary oxygenation event. Are they related? They're pretty close together.
Yeah, so this is an area of a lot of research right now. So those global glaciations that you referred to occurred 600 to 700 million years ago, and it's really an active area of debate about when and how, what did that oxygenation look like, and whether it was even, this punctuated step, like the graph that I showed you, that it could have been a much more transitional period. But people do think that the glaciations did potentially have an effect on sort of perturbing the biogeochemical cycles, yeah, so.
This will be our last question, so take it away.
Last question. Does long-term variation in the solar UV flux over this long billion-year period, how does that affect your analysis at all? In terms of the results, the isotope ratios you get and so forth?
So the variation in the solar UV flux in the early part of the Earth history, yeah, so there is this idea that the sun was fainter back in that time period. For the purposes of my analysis, looking at the granites, it doesn't affect it too much because we're trying to simply understand the connection between the sedimentary signal and the granite signal. So it's sort of what was deposited and what was preserved in the sedimentary rock records. So, but it's an aspect of early Earth that people definitely think about in relationship to atmospheric compositions. Yeah. So,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dr. Bucholtz.